So, and I will say that when Gaetana first came to me to talk to me about this, I was doing it more out of loyalty than belief. That I missed the point of how important all this is. And it didn't take long for me to learn that lesson. And the answer is part of that too. But, this is a critical part of it. And you know, I think that this is a critical part of getting through the whole cancer experience. Know that you're not alone, there are other people, and there are lots of resources out there. And I think one of the things that I want to discuss tonight is this immunotherapy, which I think it's going to, some of it might seem a little complicated. And I'm going to walk you through some of these principles and what it means and how it might implicate the treatment of cancer in general, and maybe your cancer individually. And as we go along, if you have questions, there are other members of our group that will be coming over here during the year, I think like every other month or so, to be giving talks through the year. So if you have specific things that you would like to hear and like to have discussed, by all means let us know, and that'll be the next topic. Okay, so for years, hundreds of years, people have had some idea that the immune system could somehow affect the growth of an organism, well, it could affect growth of bacteria, that the immune system, when we go back to taking vaccines of cowpox to treat smallpox, that's, you know, centuries ago. And then, well over 100 years ago, there was a surgeon in Poland who looked at taking a vaccine for a sarcoma virus, and he saw that instilling some bacteria, igniting the immune system around that sarcoma, I said virus, but around that sarcoma, could actually shrink it down. Didn't get rid of it, but it could shrink it down. So that kind of got people thinking, well, maybe there is some kind of intrinsic mechanism that could slow down cancer. That kind of got sidetracked quite a bit, because at the same time people saw benefits from radiation therapy, surgical techniques started getting developed, and then chemotherapy came along, and so the immune, it's not that people ignored the immune system, people always had an interest in it, but it didn't take on the same significance it has taken on now. When we think about the immune system, it's throughout our body. We have lymph nodes, we have we have a spleen that acts as kind of a cemetery for lots of lymphatic cells, for red cells, platelets, thymus, where things get processed, and we have lymphatic channels that carry debris to lymph nodes and carry important proteins and messaging to lymph nodes where they can get processed. And we'll talk about that in a second. One of the key things here is the bone marrow. And if we look at the bone marrow, we can see that in the bone marrow we make white cells, we make red cells, we make platelets. And these are the cells that offer defense against viruses, against bacteria. But they also have a way of recognizing anything that's foreign, even including cancer cells, cells that aren't really part of what we would call normal tissue. So these cells, in this complicated picture, there's lots of different interactions and there's lots of different communications. And the language that goes around this is a little complicated, and these slides are a little scientific, and so I'm going to kind of bring that down to somebody who hasn't done a lot of reading about all these messaging pathways, and if you have questions as I go along, just stop me. But we can follow the circle here. So, is that in focus? You see that? So, if we look at, if we say this is a tumor, and this is a cancer cell, and there are certain proteins on this cancer cell, and these proteins get picked up, again, going back here a second, get picked up by a component of these cells. They're also called antigen-presenting cells, or they're called dendritic cells. But it gets picked up by these dendritic cells, these antigen-presenting cells. This protein gets picked up, and they get carried to a lymph node. Once it's in a lymph node, it gets activated into, it's presented to a lymphocyte, a cell that can kill cancers, cells, but also kills viruses and kills bacteria. And so this foreign protein gets recognized and gets brought to the lymph node. It gets presented there with this antigen presenting cell, and then it becomes activated. So now this activated cell gets transported in through blood vessels, comes back, and it can latch onto a tumor. And when it latches onto the tumor, it can release what are called cytokines. These cytokines have the capacity to kill a cancer cell. Now, that's great, and so people looked at that. People have known about this kind of mechanism for a long time, and they said, well, why don't we just give people lots of these activated T cells, and we'll give people what's called IL-2, and it'll activate lots of those cells. The problem is, and you can see it over here a little bit, where it says these CTLs, and then there are other cancer cells in here, and there's binding cells in here. There are binding cells here that shut that system off. There are binding cells, so people would get. I'll give you a good example. Years ago, we knew that there were about a very small percentage of people with melanoma or with renal cell cancer. Even if it was very advanced, we could give them something called interleukin-2. And interleukin-2 would crank this system up. It would be like stepping on the gas. It would crank that system up, and it would send cancer cells. It would send activated T cells into the tumor with the hopes that it would kill the tumor. Well, the problem was that a lot of people got incredibly sick with these therapies, incredibly sick. And very few people got benefit. 95% of people didn't get benefit, or they got slight benefit. So why was that? Well, for years we didn't know, and we have a much better idea now. So here's what's happening. What people have learned about that in each one of these steps, there's a lot more complication. It's a lot more complicated in each step than would have otherwise previously been thought. And even if you don't look at any of the specific lettering, but the principle of this slide is that at each step in this mechanism, the green stands for something that would accelerate the process. The red is something that would shut it off. So we didn't know about this mechanism to shut it off before. We didn't know that there was a way that there was something that could shut this off. When we were giving IL-2, we were saying, why weren't people getting better? Why wasn't everybody getting better? We're giving them T cells that are going to, we know that they release cytokines, and those cytokines can kill cancer cells. Why aren't all these tumors melting down? Well, the reason was that there were these components of the cycle that were actually binding to the T cell and shutting it off. So, this is what we know now. And this is the important thing. This is called the immune synapse. And I'm just going to walk through this kind of slowly. So we have a tumor, and we have a T cell. We want this cell to kill this tumor. We have that antigen presenting cell that I just told you about. So on top of this cell, there's a protein. And this stands for MHC. That's basically, it's a compatibility factor. Can that protein, can that presenting cell bind to that T cell? Can that presenting cell make that T cell work? And the fact that these two have coupled tells us, yeah, it can. This MHC is coupled with this, and this CD8 has been activated. So what happens then? That triggers this response. That triggers this bond right here, and that activates this cell. Great. So now all these things happen. This IL-2 is released, this granzyme is released. These things, as they're released, they come into the cell and they kill this tumor cell. Everybody with me? Okay. So here's where it gets complicated, and here's where there was something we didn't know about. And what we didn't know about was, great that all this got released, but CTL4 got released. And CTL4 we know it's a factor that can release this binding capacity, this binding protein, and that shuts this off. So this CTL4 was the brake. So this is a picture of another way that the mechanism didn't work, and another way that the mechanism didn't work is if none of this binding took place. So if I go back here, remember I said this said that it could interact, and this was the actual interaction that triggered this response. Well, if you have this, yeah, you can interact, but there's nothing to interact with, well, that's another way the mechanism failed. Okay? So here's the picture of what I was just talking about. CTL4 stands for cytotoxic T lymphocyte associated protein. So this CTL4 is the brake system. And in today's language, we call that a checkpoint inhibitor. So as we learned about this, some very clever people, it was actually about 20 years ago, and I'll show you that in a minute, said, what if we could shut off the brakes? What if we could shut off that CTL4? So I'll just go back, just to go over this again. So the compatibility factor, that binds it. The activation takes place with the CD28. CD28 got activated, it was killing the cancer cell, but what happened was, as it killed the cancer cell, with all those cytokines, CTL4 was released, CTL4 came back here, and it shut this down. So there's an equilibrium here. Initially there's a cell kill, then there's some kind of balancing system, and then the problem is that there's an escape. And that's what I'm going to show you right here. All I want you to do right here is just look at these three components. Well, actually, let me walk you through the whole thing. So here's a normal tissue. Normal tissue. Somebody gets a cancer. There's been radiation therapy exposure, maybe a virus, maybe cigarettes, maybe all those things that cause cancer. The cancer starts here. So the orange is the cancer. So the cancer cell, there's a release of some of these proteins. Some of these proteins then affect those presenting cells. Those presenting cells activate the T cells, and they come back in and they kill the cancer and they bring it back to normal tissue. Great. That's the elimination part of it. But what happens is it doesn't get everything. And so some of those cells, some of that tissue gets more cancer cells, or grows more cancer cells, and now there's an equilibrium. Some of this is getting killed, some of this is growing, and then what happens is there's more tumor growth. Okay? So, when people looked at, so let me just go back here, one other thing here. This is happening on T cells. This is happening on cells that are circulating in the body. People also said, well, are there other brake systems? Are there other systems right here? And in fact, there are. So when this system was working, it started to fail, and you had more tissue, more tumor forming. When you got here, there had to be other mechanisms that were contributing factors here. And in fact, there are, and what we realized is that one of the brakes, the same way CTL4 was a brake, one of the brakes here was actually on the tumor itself. And that was called PDL1. And PDL1, it stands for programmed death ligand. So there's PD1 and PDL1. And without going into an awful lot of detail here, it's a similar type of binding mechanism, and this is a mechanism that can shut off the immune system. So, in today's world, right now, there's a host of new medicines that have come out. A lot of them, most of them that are most commonly used, are focusing on these two tools. The tool of CTL4 and PDL1. So what happens is, here's a tumor. The tumor has its binding site, PD-L1. The lymphocyte comes in, and that has PD. It can bind to that, and it can block it. So if we can block that interaction, we can continue the immune system. If we can block this interaction with CTL4, we can continue the immune system's activity. Okay? So this whole process took a long time. And this is probably one of the frustrations of just the whole development of oncology. And this is why when we look at people, we talk about the importance of clinical trials. About 3% of the people in America who would be eligible to go on a clinical trial actually go on a clinical trial. And that's a really unacceptable number, but it's been a number that's been there for many, many years. And if we look at this process, so somebody thought of this CTL4 model a long time ago. And when they talk about murine T cells, they're talking about animal models. So somebody was thinking about this for a long time. They thought about it going back over 20 years. And it took them several years to develop ipilimumab. That's a medicine that now blocks CTL4. But by the time it actually got into use clinically, it was many years later. I'll say something though that's pretty interesting. It's really interesting. In the early mid-70s, chronic myelogenous leukemia, CML, people realized there was a certain gene that, when activated, made CML more active as a disease. It took 30 years to find a medicine that could block that gene. It's incredibly effective. It took 30 years to find that gene. There are other genes now in the treatment of lung cancer that when they were identified 6 or 7 or 7 or 8 years ago, it took 3 years to identify something to target that gene. So there is absolutely a shift in our ability to find therapies that can target specific targets. But it has taken a long time to get to where we are. Okay, so, questions so far about that mechanism? Okay. It's the same, what I just showed you of that brake system, it's a brake system that we need in our body because think about it, if you have a viral infection or a bacterial infection, you need your immune response. But what if by the time you killed the bacteria, swelling or discomfort or redness or whatever, and so this is what happens when people get chronic inflammatory conditions of colitis. It may well be that they're just not shutting off that immune response well enough. All right, so what has happened when these new medicines, like the one I just showed you for ipilimumab, came out, we've learned a couple of things. Now, typically, we look at a patient historically. The patient had, for instance, a lung cancer, and they got a chemotherapy, and the lung cancer shrunk. You would look at the dimensions of the lung cancer, and you would compile a composite of what the size of that tumor was, and then you look at it, is it 50% less, is it more than 50% less, is it gone, and you have these criteria that you follow that would tell us that this thing has shrunk down and it's a very good response. What happens in the immune response, though, is that sometimes you can get swelling around the tissue. Sometimes you can get you can get actually even new lesions that become kind of flared up. And so you initially, a patient comes in, and it's happened to me, the patient comes in, the patient looks great. They're on one of these new medicines, they're seeing their appetite's better, they're breathing better, their pain's better, and you look at the scan and you say, geez, this isn't good. This happened to me a couple months ago. I came in to see the patient, I had seen the scan result first. The patient was on new treatment. I had seen the scan result and I thought, not good. I walked in and I saw the patient, he looked great. Breathing better, he felt better, his appetite was coming back. And so he fit into this criteria of what we know can happen with these immune therapies. And that is that sometimes a new spot or two or some new spots can show up that really are of no consequence, don't mean anything, and in fact the patient can still be responding. Sometimes the thing can actually look a little bit worse because there's an inflammatory response around it. So we can't get too attached to looking at that image and without looking at the context of how the patient's doing. And this is just an elaboration of the same thing. So we have this criteria that if we look at new measurable lesions, this always represents, by our old criteria, which is to the World Health Organization, this always represents progressive disease, whether they, depending on the size. So then if you said new index lesions, that these lesions are increasing in size, or if you measured if you took dimensions of the tumor, and has there been an increase of 25 to 50% over its baseline, that would tell you whether you had stable disease or whether you had progressive disease. But there were very linear, measurable responses. Here, in this is now using checkpoint inhibitors. This has changed, and it goes back to what I was just saying, that you have to look at the context of it. You have to look at how many new lesions are there. Are those new lesions dramatically increased? Are they just increased a little bit? And I would say also, you also have to look at things serially, as what's happened over not just 1 or 2 scans, but maybe 3 scans. Okay, so what I just described is what happens with what are called checkpoint inhibitors. But there's other ways that we use the immune system. And these other ways, a common tool is in treating lymphoma. We rely, so some lymphoma cancer cells express a protein called CD20. CD just stands for cluster designation. So they express this protein on their cell, CD20. And what can happen is we can create an antibody, and the antibody acts directly on that CD20 cell. You get the medicine goes to that cell. It doesn't go through that whole thing of the checkpoint inhibitors blocking CTL4. This cell comes in, it acts on that receptor, and it releases the porphyrin or the granzyme to kill the cell. Another mechanism is that sometimes you can take cells, you take blood out of a patient's bloodstream, and you can process it, and you can incubate it with different tumor antigens. You can dig with different tumor proteins. So you take the blood out, you bring in a protein that's going to mimic the tumor, and then you give people, in some instances, you give people something that's going to crank up their white cells, and then you put that back in. It's recognized as foreign, and people get an immune response to it. And then another way that you can do it is actually, you can take fragments of somebody's tumor sample, and you can incubate that, and you can incubate that with other cancers, with normal cells, and then basically can engineer a cell that when you put back in can generate an immune response. So this type of therapy is not as commonly used as this type. This is something you'd see in some of you may know about Sipuleucel T. This was a therapy that's been used for prostate cancer that showed prolongation in survival. It didn't show great responses in terms of drop in PSA or in terms of reduction in the size of lesions, but people did live longer with this. And some of you may have heard about CAR T cells, which are used in acute leukemia, that people can get an engineering of a cell that's then transfused, and that cell can elicit an immune response. Now, this is the Cancer House of Hope, and I can tell you that when I started my affiliation here, there were a pretty limited cadre of drugs. There were not a lot of cards in the deck. Since 2002 till now, we have had, this is what's come out 2013 till now. This is 2007 or 2010, and this is from 2002. This is unbelievable. This is unbelievable. So Now, are all these things a home run? Absolutely. But many of them are really good therapies. Many of them work really, really well. And people do live longer and better, and there's more reason to continue to hope that people are going to continue to live longer and better by using these therapies. Okay, so I'll stop there. If there are any questions, hopefully I can answer them. Yeah.
As far as immunotherapy is concerned, what is on the market now for prostate cancer, advanced prostate cancer?
So, Sipuleucel T is on the market. I believe that there are some studies going on with a drug called nivolumab. There are some vaccine therapies but they're not necessarily for newer. They're not for more advanced disease. And typically, the problem with the vaccines, just parenthetically, is they fit into that category of what I was describing initially, that they get shut off. Cells come in, they don't address the mechanism of what's going to shut it off. But to specifically answer your question of immune therapy, beyond Sipuleucel T, it primarily would be clinical trials that involve checkpoint inhibitors. Now, there are several therapies for advanced prostate cancer that have included taxanes, which is chemotherapy, included different ways to affect the hormone milieu of the prostate cancer cell with a medicine called enzalutamide, another medicine called abiraterone. Those are relatively new. They probably fit in, and they will be on that 3-page thing I just put up. And those are effective. What typically happens, whether you use enzalutamide first, because prostate cancer, as you know, is driven by androgen. So what deprives the cancer cell of the androgen and shuts that off will hopefully effectively treat the cancer. And whether you use enzalutamide first or abiraterone first, whatever you pick first is probably the thing that's going to give you the best response. I would have to investigate clinical trials to say what specifically could be used for advanced prostate cancer in terms of the checkpoint inhibitors. What tends to not be used, or what's being used more, I think, are these PD-L1 and PD-1 drugs. Yes.
I just want to quickly share with people here that I'm currently in a trial for a PD-L1 inhibitor, and I've been in the trial for 1.5 years, and my experience has been very positive. There's been regression in cells, and at this point, the last set of scans were no progression. And the really wonderful thing about the experience is that it has not impacted my day-to-day life. I have great appetite, I have a good deal of energy. People say you look great, so
Really?
it's for me in my particular case.
Yeah.
It's been quite effective.
Yeah. So if I could elaborate on what you just said, because you just brought up a couple of really, really important points. One is that these drugs can be incredibly well tolerated. That some people can take these drugs, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I went to check something a few months ago about a patient who I had on it. In the back of my head, I was thinking, well, she's just been on it for a couple of 3 months. She's been on it 5 months. She was just perfectly healthy and looked like $1 million and hasn't had any problem at all. And it was never anything that I thought was going to happen when I started that medicine. So number one, people can tolerate these medicines really well. Some people get really bad side effects, and some of the side effects, basically, if you think about any organ in your body, you put an itis after it, that's what you can get with PDL, with checkpoint inhibitors. So you can get colitis, you can get pneumonitis, you can get the adrenal gland can be affected. When you get colitis, which is a really serious problem with these things, you can get profound diarrhea. You don't treat that with Imodium, you don't treat that with Imodium, you treat that with steroids. What can happen though is that even when you have to take people off of these drugs, those remissions can last for a long time afterwards. That's not something we typically think of or see with chemotherapy. It's a different phenomenon, and it's a different phenomenon because if you think about our immune system has a memory. These cells remember that there was an antigen that was foreign that they had to react against, and so that's how we have antibodies. We have antibodies to all sorts of viruses and things that we were exposed to during the course of our life. That's why we're not infected all the time. So what happens is you can take somebody off these medicines, and I know the first time it happened with me, I took somebody off and I thought, oh boy, what's going to happen now? Well, you know, we're like 6 months later, the CAT scan hasn't changed one iota, and it's because these things can work for a long time. If you look at now at melanoma, I'm old enough that when I started treating people for melanoma, it was very uncommon to get any significant or meaningful response. That's changed now. People get very good responses. Some of them are profound, depending on what they have, what kind of gene expression they have. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because these can be really, really well tolerated drugs.
Yeah, well, just very quickly, I actually can drive into Dana-Farber, receive my infusion and drive home.
Drive home.
Yeah, so.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you know, come on, that doesn't happen. This is really terrific. Yeah.
How long, if you're on these checkpoint inhibitors, will it take before you do see a clinical response?
Well,
yeah.
So the clinical response you can see sometimes within just several weeks. Not uncommonly, you have to give 2 or 3 treatments, but there are people absolutely who come in and say, wow, I feel better, and they're going ahead a couple of treatments. Are there times that you might have to go a little longer? Yeah, but just as long as you're not seeing dramatic deterioration, it's probably worth forging ahead a little longer. One of the things that they were relatively new, and I put a patient on who had radiographic progression. And it was an important lesson to me. You know, I had read about the variations in scan findings, but hadn't really seen it. And so I think that patient had been on the study for a couple of months. Got the scan, he felt better, scan looked worse. Scan looked worse. Not a lot, a little. But we kept going with the medicine, and I'm glad we did. I mean, it lasted for several months more that he was doing okay. So the response can start relatively early. You're probably not going to go 6 or 8 months of being on the medicine without getting a response, and you probably have some progression that's not working. You know, some symptoms of progression, I should say. Okay. All right. Well, listen. Thank you very much for sharing tonight, and by all means, if there's any other topics that you want to hear about, please let us know. And I think somebody's going to be here every couple of months.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
As I said, this is kind of it is kind of a new day in taking care of patients with cancer. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
I got prostate cancer that went to my bones,
Yeah.
and I'm talking about from here to here.
Yeah.
Is there anything for that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's some. The hormone therapies that I talked about. There's chemotherapy. There's a radioactive isotope injection that can help slow things down. So there are a number of effective treatments. Yeah. Yeah. So don't throw the towel in without looking into all of those things, because there are absolutely you know, one of the things about treating people with cancer is that it's not just treating cancer, it's making sure, helping somebody have a good quality of life. So you have to before you start treatment, you have to say you're gonna be able to help somebody live longer and better. And better is a big deal. If you help somebody live longer and they're miserable and they're going through hell, did you really do them a lot of favors? So, I think that, you know, to have that conversation about what your goals of therapy are with your doctor, to look over options, but there are a lot of options in prostate cancer, a lot.